September 26, 1983, 0040 hours. Serpukhov 15, inside a secure command center south of Moscow. The mood was tense but routine. The Soviet Union's Oko early warning satellite system was online, scanning for American missile launches. A wall of monitors glowed in dim red light. Operators drank coffee. Outside, the forest was silent. Then an alarm, a piercing klaxon, shattered the calm. Launch detected. The console read, 1 missile, use origin, classification Minuteman III. Confirmed trajectory, Soviet territory. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, duty officer that night, stared at the screen. The missile's arc was clean. The satellite's signal was certain. Then another alarm. 2 missiles, then 3, then 4, then 5. Screen displayed the scenario every Soviet war planner feared most: a surprise first strike. 5 ICBMs launched from Montana, climbing toward Russia, now passing beyond Earth's horizon. The automated system demanded immediate escalation. Petrov was trained to respond. He had minutes no more than 15 to confirm the strike and pass it up the chain. If he did, the Soviet Union would launch everything. Thousands of warheads, full retaliation, global nuclear war. The hotline to top command blinked. Officers stared at him, pale and frozen. But something didn't sit right. Why just 5 missiles? Why not a full salvo? Why so clean a trajectory? And where was the confirmation from ground radar? Petrov's voice broke the silence. It's a false alarm. He overrode the system, refused to launch, refused to report it as valid, refused to let the machine decide. No warhead flew that night. No cities vanished. And in the aftermath, Soviet command discovered the truth. There were no missiles. There was only the sun, reflected off high-altitude clouds, misread by satellite, interpreted as the start of the end. 1 flare of sunlight, 1 man's judgment, 1 avoided Armageddon. The Cold War was built on hair triggers and worst-case scenarios, and nowhere was that more terrifying than inside the Soviet Union's early warning system, Oko. Developed in the 1970s, Oko was hailed as the future of Soviet deterrence. It used a network of satellites in highly elliptical orbits to stare down at the United States, watching for the infrared plumes of launching ICBMs. If the Americans fired first, Oko would know within seconds. That was the assumption. And Soviet command placed absolute trust in that assumption. Inside facilities like Serpukhov 15 operators were trained to treat alerts from the system as gospel, because the doctrine didn't allow time for doubt. The time between U.S. launch and impact on Moscow was less than 30 minutes. That meant the Soviets had no choice: detect, confirm, retaliate. It was a terrifyingly rigid protocol. 2 satellites needed to agree. Ground radar needed to back it. But if an alert passed those checks, retaliation was automatic. Keys turned, silos opened, missiles launched. There was no pause button. And that was the first wrong assumption, that systems, once built, would always function correctly. Engineers had faith in the math, the optics, the orbits, the software. But Oko had never seen real war. It had only run simulations, controlled tests, theory. No one had considered what might happen if space and sunlight conspired against them. No one had asked, what if the system sees what isn't there? The second wrong assumption, that operators would always follow orders. Petrov's job wasn't to question. His job was to confirm. Report up the chain. Initiate next steps. That's what every protocol demanded. But what the Soviet command never accounted for, what their system was never designed to handle, was hesitation. Not cowardice, not confusion, judgment. Stanislav Petrov had been trained to trust the machine. But in the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, he trusted his instincts more. And because of that, everything we know survived. Soviet nuclear doctrine in the early 1980s was not built for flexibility. It was built for certainty. If the United States launched, the USSR had to respond immediately. The strategy was called launch on warning. The moment a nuclear launch was detected, Soviet missiles would be fired before the enemy's warheads could land. The logic was grim but clear. If you wait to absorb a strike, you lose your command centers. You die second, but still die. That's why Soviet planners didn't design for ambiguity. There was no space for second guesses. Detection equaled confirmation. Confirmation equaled retaliation. Retaliation equaled total war. The Oko satellite system was supposed to make this process faster, cleaner, and more reliable. It was installed to cut down decision time from minutes to seconds. The satellites fed infrared signatures to bunkers like Serpukhov 15, where duty officers had a checklist, a timer, and a direct line to launch command. But what they didn't have was control. Once a launch was confirmed, the orders came from above. The officers on the ground were not decision makers. They were cogs. And so, the system they built was both cutting-edge and horrifyingly brittle, because it assumed that computers would never lie. It assumed the United States would never launch just one or two missiles. It assumed that war would look like the playbook predicted, and that's where it broke. When Petrov's console showed 5 launches, 5 exactly, spaced evenly. From the same area in Montana, the system saw textbook enemy behavior. Every warning light lit up. Every sensor confirmed it. But doctrine had no answer to the question Petrov was asking himself in silence. Why only 5 if this was a real U.S.? First strike. It would involve hundreds of missiles, not a handful. Why would America start a war that way? The doctrine said respond. Petrov said wait. The doctrine said escalate. Petrov said no. And for that hesitation, the Soviet launch machine stalled. The Cold War system built for instant destruction had met something it never accounted for: a human being who refused to obey it. At 0040 Moscow time, Oko's orbital satellite, Cosmos 11382, triggered a Level 1 alert. A single Minuteman III missile had launched from a U.S. base in Montana. The infrared sensors designed to detect the heat bloom of rocket engines flagged the signal as unmistakable. Petrov froze. Training dictated one thing: verify, confirm, escalate. But something in his gut pushed back. Seconds later, a second launch, then a third. By the minute's end, 5 missiles. The display screen screamed urgency. Indicators blinked red. The algorithm, hardened into Soviet protocol, was executing its judgment. This is not a malfunction. Petrov's officers looked to him. His superior wasn't in the room. The only man in charge was him, and the machine was telling him, the United States has begun a nuclear war. There was no second satellite in line of sight. Ground-based radar, crucial for confirmation, was not yet in range. It would take several more minutes before any warhead rose high enough to be picked up by terrestrial systems, the launch window closing rapidly. If he reported this up the chain as real, it would go to General Staff in seconds. Within minutes, the Soviet response force would move to launch readiness, and from there, retaliation would be unleashed. Petrov hesitated. He thought about the pattern. 5 missiles, not 500, not even 50. It didn't make strategic sense. A U.S. first strike would be overwhelming, not limited. He thought about the political climate. Tensions were high just weeks after the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 civilians, including Americans. Washington was angry. Moscow was defensive. The world was fraying. But nuclear war over 5 missiles. He knew the satellite's angle. He knew it was in a part of its orbit where sunlight could interfere with detection. He knew the software wasn't perfect. He knew the system had never been tested under these exact conditions, and so he made his decision. He turned to his team. He overrode the alert. He reported it as a false alarm. No one in the bunker spoke. The red lights stayed lit, but the missiles never came. And hours later, the answer was confirmed. There had been no launch, no missiles, no war, just a rare alignment of sunlight, cloud cover, and orbital geometry that fooled the system into thinking Earth was on fire. Petrov had stopped the launch by breaking the machine. The next morning, Petrov filed his report. It was dry, procedural, stripped of drama, just a log of the events, the alert, and his decision to mark it as false. He expected a debrief, perhaps a commendation, maybe even thanks. Instead, he was met with silence, then suspicion. High command summoned him not to congratulate, but to interrogate. Why had he failed to follow protocol who authorized him to override a satellite-confirmed launch? What if he had been wrong? What if war had already begun? The questions weren't about truth. They were about obedience in Soviet military hierarchy. Systems were sacred. Procedures were law. Deviating from command, no matter the reason, was insubordination. Petrov tried to explain. The missile count didn't add up. The satellite was in a sun interference orbit. There was no corroboration from ground radar. The launch pattern was tactically absurd, but logic didn't matter. The system had registered a launch, and he had disobeyed it. Within days, Petrov was reassigned. No punishment, no court-martial, just quiet exile. A career sidelined. The incident itself buried. No public disclosure, no internal reform. The Soviet government kept the near launch classified for over a decade. Inside the Defense Ministry, the failure was reframed not as a flaw in Oko, but as operator error, the official line. The system functioned correctly. What nearly happened was never acknowledged, but behind closed doors, the doubts were growing. Radar engineers began whispering about design flaws. Satellite technicians flagged the need for better sun-angle filters. Senior officers, still shaken, began pressing for multi-source confirmation protocols, yet none of it made it to policy. Because admitting the truth meant admitting that Soviet nuclear doctrine had almost triggered Armageddon based on a glitch, that their billion-ruble early warning system had mistaken sunlight for fire, and that only one man's disobedience had prevented the destruction of the Soviet Union and the United States. But the Kremlin couldn't honor that truth, because it would expose the system's fragility, its blind spots, its inhuman reliance on automation. So instead of medals, Petrov got silence. Instead of reform, the doctrine stayed unchanged. Because for Moscow to admit what had almost happened would have been worse than any military defeat. It would have meant admitting they had built a machine of annihilation. That didn't know the difference between war and weather in the weeks following the incident. Soviet analysts scrambled to explain away the false alarm. They couldn't afford to admit a system failure. So, they looked for a theory that would save face. And they found one, a limited American test launch. It was neat, plausible, convenient. The Americans, they speculated, had conducted a covert launch of 5 unarmed missiles, perhaps a warning shot, a signal, a test of Soviet response time. The infrared signatures matched too cleanly to dismiss. It wasn't an error. They claimed it was a probe. That explanation made everyone feel safer, because if it was a test, then the system had worked. If it was a test, then Petrov had simply misjudged. If it was a test, then Moscow's retaliation delay wasn't a failure, just restraint. But there was one problem. There was no launch. USSR satellite data, later released after the Cold War, showed zero missile activity on September 26, 1983. No rumblings in Montana. No warhead telemetry. Nothing moved. Western tracking stations confirmed it. International watchdogs confirmed it. Even Soviet secondary channel spy satellites. Human intelligence reported no anomalies. The launch never happened. The only thing that did happen was the satellite's sensor failure. Yet, this truth was inconvenient, because it revealed a terrifying fact. The entire Soviet nuclear retaliation system had come one officer away from global war, triggered by a false reading from a satellite, and not a single verification layer caught it. So the test launch theory remained quietly accepted, filed into archives, cited in internal memos, a lie wrapped in technical jargon, because the alternative that sunlight on high-altitude clouds had fooled their best satellite was too horrifying to confront. It meant their space-based early warning system was vulnerable to the sky itself, that their doctrine had no resilience, that their plan for survival was built on trust in a blinking red light. Years later, even after Petrov's account became public, the test launch story still circulated in Soviet military academies, not because they believed it, but because it was safer than saying the truth. We nearly destroyed the world because our satellite mistook the sun for a missile. As pressure mounted to explain the satellite's failure, without exposing systemic flaws, Soviet engineers offered another narrative operator error. This time, the blame didn't rest with the Americans, or the sky, or even the system. It rested on Stanislav Petrov himself. If the first wrong theory offered the illusion of American provocation, this second one offered something far more politically useful, a scapegoat. The theory was simple. Petrov had misinterpreted the data, that the satellite had done its job, but the officer in the chair had failed his. That war had not come because of him, but had nearly come in spite of him. This explanation fit neatly into Soviet doctrine. The system could not be flawed. Only people could be. And yet, this argument fell apart on the first page of the after-action report. Petrov had logged everything: the timing of the alerts, the angles of the satellite's orbit, the lack of confirmation from any ground radar, the improbable nature of 5 evenly spaced missile launches. His decision not to escalate based not on hesitation, but on contradictory data. He had documented every step, every decision, every calculation. More telling, the Internal Review Board, tasked with evaluating the incident, never once claimed the satellite's alert was correct. They never found evidence of a U.S. launch. They never found corroboration from a backup system. So how could Petrov be wrong if the missiles never existed? The operator error theory was political, not technical. It existed to preserve the illusion of control, to protect the chain of command, to shield doctrine from admitting its most dangerous vulnerability. That even a perfect soldier, following perfect orders, might have launched a war based on a ghost. Petrov didn't misinterpret the data. He saw its flaw and chose to defy it. And that's what terrified the system most. Not that the satellite had failed, but that a man had dared to say so. By 1983, the Soviet Union had invested billions into its space-based early warning systems. The Oko program, launched in the mid-70s, was supposed to ensure a technological advantage in strategic defense, finally giving the USSR a rapid, independent detection grid to match the USite satellites under NORAD. On paper, it worked. The satellites orbited in Molniya trajectories, optimized to hover over North America during high-risk hours. Each carried advanced infrared sensors, looking for the heat bloom of U.S. ICBM launches. The system could, in theory, detect and verify a nuclear attack within 30 seconds. But in practice, it had a flaw, a simple one, a cosmic one: the sun. On September 26, the satellite that triggered the alarm was in a transitional phase of its orbit, just as sunlight was bouncing off high-altitude cloud tops over the central U.S. The reflected sunlight created the exact heat signature the Oko system was trained to detect. It wasn't a random glitch. It was a predictable optical illusion caused by orbital geometry and solar reflection. The engineers had missed it. There was no filter in place, no cross-sensor comparison, no AI calibration to distinguish between a 12,000-kilometer nuclear flame and sunlight on cirrus clouds. This failure wasn't just in hardware. It was in intelligence design. Despite decades of espionage, the Soviet system had no redundant cross-confirmation at the software level. Despite having advanced scientific institutions, no one had modeled how cloud reflectivity could fool orbital sensors. Despite having layers of command, there was no procedural delay for human judgment. The Americans, by contrast, had engineered their systems around skepticism. NORAD required multiple independent confirmation methods: ground radar, missile warning satellites, seismic sensors, oceanic tracking. And even then, presidential authority included direct challenge protocols and time delays. The U.S. system, for all its speed, expected false positives. The Soviet system dared not imagine them. So when the sun lit up the clouds that night, it lit up something else: a catastrophic blind spot in Soviet planning. One flare of light misread by an untested satellite, fed into an unquestioned system, carried by loyal officers, and the world came within seconds of thermonuclear war, all because no one had asked, what if the sky lies? And because of that failure, a machine mistook daylight for Armageddon, and only one man refused to believe it. While the Soviet Union leaned into speed and rigidity, the United States built its nuclear detection architecture around verification, redundancy, and delay. America's answer to the threat of a surprise first strike wasn't to respond faster, it was to respond smarter. The core of the U.S. system was NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, anchored deep within Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. From there, a multi-layered matrix of sensors monitored every inch of the sky: land, sea, and space. The U.S. had used not one satellite, but constellations of them DSP Defense Support Program birds in geostationary orbit, watching for heat signatures of launches. Each satellite's alert was cross-checked with data from ground-based radar installations in Alaska, Greenland, the UK, and across Europe, undersea sonar arrays that listened for submarine launches, seismic sensors to detect ground-based tests or launches, visual confirmation when possible, and critically, no single detection could trigger a launch. The U.S. also had safeguards at the political level: the nuclear football. The decision briefcase, always carried by the president, didn't just contain launch codes, it contained authentication steps, options, and verification procedures. Even during the most tense moments, like Able Archer in 1983 or NORAD's own false alarms in the 1970s, the American response wasn't automatic. It was deliberately resistant to speed. Why? Because the U.S. system was designed with one truth in mind: machines make mistakes. The U.S. had already lived through false alerts like the infamous 1979 training tape incident, when a simulation accidentally ran in real time and appeared to show 200 Soviet missiles incoming. Even then, generals double-checked. No launches happened, no retaliation triggered. That incident alone led to tightened protocols and more layered confirmation. Meanwhile, Soviet strategy treated doubt as weakness. Their system had no space for multiple opinions, no built-in lag for human discretion, no cultural tolerance for deviation from command. It was a missile machine, not a judgment system, and when it came time for that system to face its test in 1983, it failed. Not because it lacked power, but because it lacked skepticism. The true American system wasn't perfect, but it was built to survive the one moment that mattered most when the screen flashes red. And the only thing between peace and extinction is the ability to ask, are we sure? What happened in Serpukhov 15 on September 26, 1983 was never made public. There were no news reports, no declassified bulletins, just a quiet note in a locked archive and a man who walked out of the building alive, but already forgotten. Yet inside Soviet high command, the consequences were seismic. The realization that the USSR had come within minutes of launching a full-scale nuclear retaliation on a signal caused by sunlight shook the strategic rocket forces to their core. But there would be no admission of failure, no reform, no apology, no award for Petrov. Instead, the humiliation was buried because it revealed how fragile the Soviet nuclear posture really was. For decades, the USSR had projected total readiness. Their missiles were fast, their satellites advanced, their command structure unshakable. But in truth, they had built a system that relied entirely on blind faith in technology. A single false alert had nearly started the end of human civilization, and nothing in their doctrine had prepared them to question it. The United States, years earlier, had experienced a similar false alarm in 1979. A faulty training tape simulating a Soviet attack nearly triggered a scramble, but American command paused, verified, delayed, and caught the error, the Soviet system. It didn't delay. It didn't verify. It moved toward the key, and it had only stopped because one man refused to follow orders. Stanislav Petrov did what the machine could not. He thought, he judged, he waited. And for that, he was erased. He wasn't fired. He wasn't honored. He was simply moved sideways, quietly retired, and left in obscurity. For years. Not even his family understood what he had done, because acknowledging Petrov's action meant admitting that the Soviet launch system was flawed at the core. That deterrence had been a bluff, that retaliation was built on guesses, that total war had nearly been unleashed because no one anticipated a cloud reflecting sunlight. In the years after, Soviet engineers began patching the system. Sun angle calibrations were added, cross-checks increased, but the doctrine didn't change. Because to change it would be to admit that the enemy had been right all along, that trust without verification is suicide. For the Soviet leadership, the near apocalypse of September 1983 didn't just expose a technical failure, it shattered a core belief that the USSR could control the nuclear balance through mechanical certainty. The Soviets had always believed that sheer systemization would protect them. If the procedures were followed, if the satellites were working, if the radar held, then retaliation would be assured. Mutual assured destruction was the anchor of their deterrence, and they trusted the machine to deliver it. But after Serpukhov 15, that trust began to rot, because it was now clear that the machine was blind, that the algorithm could be tricked, that the entire Soviet nuclear response could be triggered by an optical illusion. and worse, that no one had known. Soviet generals, already under pressure from economic decline and political stagnation, now faced an existential question they couldn't answer. What if the next launch alert was real? But the man in the bunker refused to believe it. Or worse, what if the next alert was false? And the man in the bunker did believe it. That paradox of trust versus doubt had no place in Soviet military doctrine. Their system relied on obedience, on automation, on elimination of discretion. But Petrov's refusal had proven a terrifying truth. Disobedience had saved the world. That concept was not just strategically dangerous, it was ideologically blasphemous. For the Soviet state, built on the supremacy of the collective, of the chain of command, of the infallible party, the idea that a single man's personal judgment had preserved global peace was intolerable. So they buried it. They buried the failure. They buried the reform. And they buried Petrov. But inside the quiet halls of Soviet Missile Command, something shifted. The officers knew. The engineers whispered. The realists began to understand their system was not just fallible. It was vulnerable to the sky itself. And in that realization, a collapse began not with tanks or treaties, but with a single moment in which the entire Soviet nuclear machine depended on whether one man believed what he saw, and he didn't. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017 alone in a small apartment near Moscow. No medals, no military pension, no ceremony, just a faded uniform and a stack of documents no one wanted to read for decades. The story of what happened on September 26, 1983, remained buried, classified, redacted, ignored, not because it was insignificant, but because it was too significant to admit. Because in a world divided by nuclear standoff, the truth was almost unthinkable. The end of humanity had nearly been triggered by a cloud, a satellite, and a flash of sunlight. And it had been prevented not by a supercomputer, not by a general, not by a failsafe, but by a man who chose not to believe what the machine told him. Today, Petrov's name lives in whispers, documentaries, interviews, a few late recognitions from abroad. The United Nations once gave him a plaque. Some called him the man who saved the world. He didn't like the title. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be right. He had seen enough tests, enough flaws, enough orbital anomalies to know something wasn't right that night, and that made all the difference. In the years since, militaries across the world have layered verification systems, artificial intelligence, redundancy protocols. They've tried to ensure that what happened on that night can't happen again. But the ghost still lingers. In every silo, every satellite, every early warning command post, the specter of Petrov's decision remains, that in a world built for instant retaliation, sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the assumption that the machine is never wrong. As long as nuclear weapons exist, so does the possibility of error. And so does the need for one human voice to say, wait.